Hey everybody, how you doing today? This is Anjanette from AJ's Personal Touch. Welcome back to my subscribers and welcome into anybody who is new. Today I'm going to be reading out of Anna Karenina. And today for you, I'm hoping not to fall asleep while I'm reading it. I was getting ready to come on, about 2 hours ago, and I did pool therapy today, and I came home and I sat down to do this and I crashed. So here is my try number 2 at reading Anna Karenina. Starting with chapter 20, book, I always want to call it book 2, part 2, chapter 24. Oh, gotta put on pause already. I forgot my glasses. Okay, longer on my end than on yours. So here we go. Oh, I have these on top of my head with my hair. Now wait. That made it so the other side had an issue. Perfect. When Vronsky looked at his watch on the Karenin's balcony, he was so greatly agitated and lost in his thoughts that he saw the figures on the watch's face, but could not take in what time it was. He came out on the high road and walked, picking his way carefully through the mud to his carriage. He was so completely absorbed in his feeling for Anna that he did not even think what o'clock it was, and whether he had time to go to Branska Bryansky's. He had left him, as often happens, only the external faculty of memory that points out each step one has to take one after the other. He went up to his coachman, who was dozing on the box in the shadow, already lengthening of a thick lime tree. He admired the shifting clouds of midges circling over the hot horses, and walking the coachman, he jumped into the carriage and told him to drive to Bryansky's. It was only after driving nearly 5 miles that he had sufficiently recovered himself to look at his watch and realize that it was 5:30 and he was late. There were several races fixed for that day: the mounted guards race, then the officers' mile-and-a-half race, then the 3-mile race, and then the race for which he was entered. He could still be in time for his race, but if he went to Bryansky's he could only just be in time, and he would arrive when the whole of the court would be in their places. That would be a pity, but he had promised Bryansky to come, and so he decided to drive on, telling the coachman not to spare the horses. He reached Bryansky's and spent 5 minutes there, and galloped back to the rapid drive and galloped back. This rapid drive calmed him. All that was painful in his relations with Anna, all the feelings of indefiniteness left by their conversation, had slipped out of his mind. He was thinking now with pleasure and excitement of the race, of his being, anyhow, in time, and now and then the thought of the blissful interview awaiting him that night flashed across his imagination like a flaming light. The excitement of the approaching race gained upon him as he drove farther and farther into the atmosphere of the races, overtaking carriages, driving up from the summer villas or out of Petersburg. At his quarters no one was left at home, all were at the races, and his valet was looking out for him at the gate. While he was changing his clothes, his valet told him that the second race had begun already, that a lot of gentlemen had been to ask for him, and a boy had twice run up from the stables. Dressing without hurry, he never hurried himself, and never lost his self-possession. Vronsky drove to the sheds. From the sheds he could see a perfect sea of carriages and people on foot, soldiers surrounding the race course, and pavilions swarming with people. The second race was apparently going on, for just as he went into the sheds, he heard a bell ringing. Going towards the stable, he met the white-legged chestnut, Mahouton's gladiator, being led to the race course in a blue forage horsecloth, with what looked like huge ears edged with blue. "Where's Cord?" he asked the stable boy. "In the stable, putting on the saddle." In the open horse box stood Frou Frou, saddled ready. They were just going to lead her out. "I'm not too late?" All right," said the Englishman. "Don't upset yourself." Vronsky once more took in one glance the exquisite lines of his favorite mare, who was quivering all over, and with an effort he tore himself from the sight of her, and went out of the stable. He went towards the pavilions at the most favorable moment for escaping attention. The mile-and-a-half race was just finishing, and all eyes were fixed on the horse guard in front of the light hussar behind, urging their horses on with the last effort close to the winning post. From the center and outside of the ring, all were crowding to the winning post, and a group of soldiers and officers of the horse guards were shouting loudly their delight at the expected triumph of their officer and comrade. Vronsky moved into the middle of the crowd unnoticed, almost at the very moment when the bell rang at the finish of the race, and the tall, mud-spattered horse guard who came in first, bending over the saddle, let go the reins of his panting gray horse that looked dark with sweat. The horse, stiffening out its legs with an effort, stopped its rapid course, and the officer of the horse guards looked round him like a man waking up from a heavy sleep, and just managed to smile. A crowd of friends and outsiders pressed round him. Vronsky intentionally avoided that select crowd of the upper world which was moving and talking with discreet freedom before the pavilions. He knew that Madame Karenina was there, and Betsy and his brother's wife, and he purposely did not go near them for fear of something distracting his attention. But he was continually met and stopped by acquaintances who told him about the previous races and kept asking him why he was so late. At the time when the races had just at the time when the racers had to go to the pavilion to receive the prizes, and all attention was directed to that point, Vronsky's elder brother Alexander, a colonel with heavy fringed epaulets, came up to him. He was not tall, though as broadly built as Alexei, and handsomer and rosier than he. He had a red nose and an open, drunken-looking face. "Did you get my note?" he said. "There's never any finding you." Alexander Vronsky, in spite of the dissolute life, and in especial the drunken habits for which he was notorious, was quite one of the court circle. Now, as he talked to his brother of a matter bound to be exceedingly disagreeable to him, knowing that the eyes of many people might be fixed upon him, he kept a smiling countenance as though he were jesting with his brother about something of little moment. "I got it, and I really can't make out what you were worrying yourself about," said Alexei. "I'm worrying myself because the remark has just been made to me that you weren't here, that you were seen in Peterhof on Monday. There are matters which only concern those directly interested in them, and the matter you are so worried about is—" "Yes, but if so, you may as well cut the service. I beg you not to meddle, and that's all I have to say." Alexei Vronsky's frowning face turned white, and his prominent lower jaw quivered, which happened rarely with him. Being a man of very warm heart, he was seldom angry, but when he was angry, and when his chin quivered, then, as Alexander Vronsky knew, he was dangerous. Alexander Vronsky smiled gaily. "I only wanted to give you mother's letter. Answer it, and don't worry about anything just before the race. Bon chance," he added, smiling, and he moved away from him. But after him another friendly greeting brought Vronsky to a standstill. "So you won't recognize your friends? How are you, mon cher?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, as conspicuously brilliant in the midst of all the Petersburg brilliance as he was in Moscow, his face rosy and his whiskers sleek and glossy. "I came up yesterday, and I'm delighted that I shall see your triumph. When shall we meet? Come tomorrow to the mess room, said Vronsky, and squeezing him by the sleeve of his coat, with apologies, he moved away to the center of the race course, where the horses were being led for the great steeplechase. The horses who had run in the last race were being led home, steaming and exhausted, by the stable boys, and one after another the fresh horses for the coming race made their appearance, for the most part English racers wearing horsecloths, and looking with their drawn-up bellies like strange huge birds. On the right was led in Frou-Frou, lean and beautiful, lifting up her elastic, rather long pasterns, as though moved by springs. Not far from her, they were taking the rug off the lop-eared gladiator. The strong, exquisite, perfectly correct lines of the stallion, with the superb hindquarters and excessively short pasterns almost over his hoofs, attracted Vronsky's attention in spite of himself. He would have gone up to his mare, but he was again detained by an acquaintance. "Oh, there's Karenin," said the acquaintance with whom he was chatting. "He's looking for his wife, and she's in the middle of the pavilion. Didn't you see her?" "No," answered Vronsky, and without even glancing round towards the pavilion, where his friend was pointing out Karenina, he went up to his mare. Vronsky had not had time to look at the saddle, about which had to give him some direction, when the competitors were summoned to the pavilion to receive their numbers and places in the row at starting. 17 officers, looking serious and severe, many with pale faces, met together in the pavilion and drew the numbers. Vronsky drew the number 7. The cry was heard, "Mount!" Feeling that with the others riding in the race he was the center upon which all eyes were fastened, Vronsky walked up to his mare in that state of nervous tension in which he usually became deliberate and composed in his movements. Cord, in honor of the races, had put on his best clothes, a black coat buttoned up, a stiffly starched collar which propped up his cheeks, a round black hat, and top boots. He was calm and dignified as ever, and with his own hands holding Frou-Frou by both reins, standing straight in front of her. Frou-Frou was still trembling as though in a fever. Her eye, full of fire, glanced sideways at Vronsky. Vronsky slipped his finger under the saddle girth. The mare glanced aslant at him, drew up her lip, and twitched her ear. The Englishman puckered up his lips, intending to indicate a smile that anyone should verify his saddling. "Get up, you won't feel so excited." Vronsky looked round for the last time at his rivals. He knew that he would not see them during the race. 2 were already riding forward to the point from which they were to start. Galston, a friend of Vronsky's and one of the more formidable rivals, was moving round a bay horse that would not let him mount. A little lighter hussar in tight riding breeches rode off at a gallop, crouched up like a cat on the saddle, in imitation of English jockeys. Prince Kuzelev sat with a white face on his thoroughbred mare from the Grabovsky stud, while an English groom led her by the bridle. Vronsky and all his comrades knew Kuzelev and his peculiarity of weak nerves and terrible vanity. They knew that he was afraid of everything, afraid of riding a spirited horse. But now, just because it was terrible, because people broke their necks and there was a doctor standing at each obstacle, and an ambulance with a cross on it, and a sister of mercy, had made up his mind to take part in the race. Their eyes met, and Vronsky gave him a friendly and encouraging nod. Only once he did not see his chief rival, Mahotin, on Gladiator. "Don't be in a hurry," said Cord to Vronsky, "and remember one thing. Don't hold her in the fences, and don't urge her on. Let her go as she likes." All right," said Vronsky, taking the reins. "If you can lead the race, but don't lose heart till the last minute, even if you're behind." Before the mare had time to move, Vronsky stepped with an agile, vigorous movement into the steel-toothed stirrup, and lightly and firmly seated himself on the creaking leather of the saddle. Getting his right foot in the stirrup, he smoothed the double reins, as he always did, between his fingers, and Cord let go. As though she did not know which foot to put first, Frou-Frou started dragging at the reins with her long neck, and as though she were on springs, shaking her rider from side to side. Cord quickened his step following him. The excited mare, trying to shake off her rider, first on one side and then the other, pulled at the reins, and Vronsky tried in vain with voice and hand to soothe her. They were just reaching the dammed up stream on their way to the starting point. Several of the riders were in front and several behind, when suddenly Vronsky heard the sound of the horse galloping in the mud behind him, and he was overtaken by Mahotin on his white-legged, lop-eared gladiator. Mahotin smiled, showing his long teeth, but Vronsky looked angrily at him. He did not like him, and regarded him now as his most formidable rival. He was angry with him for galloping past and exciting his mare. Frou-Frou started into a gallop. Her left foot forward made 2 bounds, and fretting at the tightened reins, passed into a jolting trot, bumping her rider up and down. Cord, too, scowled and followed Vronsky almost at a trot. Chapter 25. There were 17 officers in all riding in this race. The racecourse was a large 3-mile ring of the form of an ellipse in front of the pavilion. On this course, 9 obstacles had been arranged. The stream, a big and solid barrier 5 feet high, just before the pavilion, a dry ditch, a ditch full of water, a precipitous slope, an Irish barricade, one of the most difficult obstacles, consisting of a mound fenced with brushwood, beyond which was a ditch out of the sight for the horses, so that the horse had to clear both obstacles or might be killed. Then 2 more ditches filled with water, and one dry one, and the end of the race was just facing the pavilion. But the race began not in the ring, but 200 yards away from it, and in that part of the course was the first obstacle, a dammed-up stream, 7 feet in breadth, which the racers could leap or wade through as they preferred. 3 times they were ranged ready to start, but each time some horse thrust itself out of line, and they had to begin again. The umpire who was starting them, Colonel Sestrin, was beginning to lose his temper, when at last the 4th time he shouted, "Away!" and the racers started. Every eye, every opera glass, was turned on the brightly colored group of riders. At that moment they were in line to start. "They're off! They're starting!" was heard on all sides after the hush of expectation, and little groups and solitary figures among the public began running from place to place to get a better view. In the very first minute the close group of horsemen drew out, and it could be seen that they were approaching the stream in 2s and 3s, and one behind another. To the spectators it seemed as though they had all started simultaneously, but to the racers there were seconds of differences that had great value to them. Frou-Frou, excited and over-nervous, had lost the first moment, and several horses had started before her. But before reaching the stream, Vronsky, who was holding in the mare with all his force, as she tugged at the bridle, easily overtook 3, and there were left in front of them Mahotin's chestnut gladiator, whose hindquarters were moving lightly and rhythmically up and down exactly in front of Vronsky, and in front of all the dainty mare Diana, bearing Kuzovlev, more dead than alive. For the first instant, Vronsky was not master either of himself or his mare. Up to the first obstacle, the stream, he could not guide the motions of his mare. Gladiator and Diana came up to it together, and almost at the same instant, simultaneously, they rose above the stream and flew across to the other side. Frou-Frou darted after them, as if flying, but at the very moment when Vronsky felt himself in the air, he suddenly saw almost under his mare's hoofs Kuzovlev, who was floundering with Diana on the farther side of the stream. Suslov had let go of the reins as he took the leap, and the mare had sent him flying over her head. Those details Vronsky learned later. At the moment, all he saw was that just under him, where Frou Frou must alight, Diana's legs or head might be in the way. But Frou Frou drew up her legs and back in the very act of leaping like a falling cat, and clearing the other mare, alighted beyond her. Oh, the darling, thought Vronsky. After crossing the stream, Vronsky had complete control of his mare and began holding her in, intending to cross the great barrier behind Mahotin and to try and overtake him in the clear ground of about 500 yards that followed it. The great barrier stood just in front of the imperial pavilion. The Tsar and the whole court and crowds of people were all gazing at them, at him and Mahotin a length ahead of him as they drew near the devil, as, as the solid barrier was called. Vronsky was aware of those eyes fastened upon him from all sides, but he saw nothing except the ears and neck of his own mare, and ground racing to meet him, and the back and white legs of Gladiator beating time swiftly before him, and keeping always the same distance ahead. Gladiator rose with no sound of knocking against anything. With a wave of his short tail, he disappeared from Vronsky's sight. "Bravo!" cried a voice. At the same instant, under Vronsky's eyes, right before him, flashed the palings of the barrier. Without the slightest change in her action, his mare flew over it. The palings vanished, and he heard only a crash behind him. The mare, excited by Gladiator's keeping ahead, had risen too soon before the barrier and grazed it with her hind hoofs. But her pace never changed, and Vronsky, feeling a spatter of mud in his face, realized that he was once more the same distance from Gladiator. Once more he perceived in front of him the same back and short tail, and again the same swiftly moving white legs that got no farther away. At the very moment when Vronsky thought that now was the time to overtake Mahotin, Frou Frou herself, understanding his thoughts without any incitement on his part, gained ground considerably and began getting alongside of Mahotin on the most favorable side, close close to the inner cord. Mahotin would not let her pass that side. Vronsky had hardly formed the thought that he could perhaps pass on the other side when Frou Frou shifted her pace and began overtaking him on the other side. Frou Frou's shoulder, being by now to be dark with sweat, was even with Gladiator's back. For a few lengths they moved evenly, but before the obstacle they were approaching, Vronsky began working at the reins, anxious to avoid having to take the outer circle, and swiftly passed Mahotin just upon the declivity. He caught a glimpse of his mud-stained face as he flashed by. He even fancied he smiled. Vronsky passed Mahotin, but he was immediately aware of him close upon him, and he never ceased hearing the even thudding hoofs and the rapid and still quite fresh breathing of Gladiator. The next two obstacles, the watercourse and the barrier, were easily crossed, but Vronsky began to hear the snorting and thud of Gladiator closer upon him. He urged on his mare, and to his delight felt that she easily quickened her pace, and the thud of Gladiator's hoofs was again heard at the same distance away. Vronsky was at the head of the race, just as he wanted to be, and as Cord had advised, and now he felt sure of being the winner. His excitement, his delight, and his tenderness for Frou Frou grew keener and keener. He longed to look round again, but he did not dare to do this, and tried to be cool and not to urge on his mare, so to keep the same reserve of force in her as he felt the Gladiator still kept. There remained only one obstacle, the most difficult. If he could cross it ahead of the others, he would come in first. He was flying towards the Irish barricade. Frou Frou and he both together saw the barricade in the distance, and both the man and the mare had a moment's hesitation. He saw the uncertainty in the mare's ears and lifted the whip, but at the same time he felt that his fears were groundless. The mare knew what was wanted. She quickened her pace and rose smoothly, just as he had fancied she would, and as she left the ground, gave herself up to the force of her rush, which carried her far beyond the ditch, and with the same rhythm, without effort, with the same leg forward, Frou Frou fell back into her pace again. Bravo, Vronsky! He heard shouts from the knot of men. He knew they were his friends in the regiment who were standing at the obstacle. He could not fail to recognize Yashvin's voice, though he did not see him. "Oh, my sweet," he said inwardly to Frou Frou as he listened for what was happening behind. "He's cleared it," he thought, catching the thud of the gladiator's hoofs behind him. There remained only the last ditch filled with water and 5 feet wide. Vronsky did not even look at it, but anxious to get in a long way first, began sawing away at the reins, lifting the mare's head and letting it go in time with her pace. He felt that the mare was at the very least reserved of strength. Not her neck and shoulders merely were wet, but the sweat was standing in drops on her mane. Her head, her sharp ears, and her breath came in short, sharp gasps. But he knew that she had strength left more than enough for the remaining 500 yards. It was only from the feeling himself nearer the ground and from the peculiar smoothness of his motion that Vronsky knew how greatly the mare had quickened her pace. She flew over the ditch as though not noticing it. She flew over it like a bird, but at the same instant Vronsky, to his horror, felt that he had failed to keep up with the mare's pace, and he did not know how, made a fearful, unpardonable mistake in recovering his seat in the saddle. All at once his position had shifted, and he knew that something awful had happened. He could not yet make out what had happened when the white legs of the chestnut horse flashed by close to him, and Mahotin passed as a swift gallop. Vronsky was touching the ground with one foot, and his mare was sinking on that foot. He had just time to free his leg when she fell on one side, gasping painfully and making vain efforts to rise with her delicate soaking neck. She fluttered on the ground at his feet like a shot bird. The clumsy movement made by Vronsky had broken her back, but that he only knew much later. At the moment he knew only that Mahotin had flown swiftly by, while he stood staggering alone on the muddy, motionless ground, and Frou Frou lay gasping before him, bending her head back and gazing at him with her exquisite eyes. Still unable to realize what had happened, Vronsky tugged at his mare's reins. Again she struggled all over like a fish, and her shoulders, setting the saddle heaving. She rose on her front legs, but unable to lift her back, she quivered all over and again fell on her side. With a face hideous with passion, his lower jaw trembling, and his cheeks white, Vronsky kicked her with his heel in the stomach, and again fell to tugging at the rein. She did not stir, but thrusting her nose into the ground, she simply gazed at her master with her speaking eyes. "Ah," groaned Vronsky, clutched at his head. "Ah, what have I done?" he cried. "The race lost, and my fault, shameful, unpardonable, and the poor darling ruined mare. Ah, what have I done?" A crowd of men, a doctor and his assistant, the officers of his regiment, ran up to him. To his misery he felt that he was whole and unhurt. The mare had broken her back, and it was decided to shoot her. Vronsky could not answer questions, could not speak to anyone. He turned, and without picking up his cap that had fallen off, walked away from the race course, not knowing where he was going. He felt utterly wretched. For the first time in his life, he knew the bittersweet sort of misfortune, misfortune beyond remedy, and caused by his own fault. Yashvin overtook him with his cap and led him home, and half an hour later Vronsky had regained his self-possession, but the memory of that race remained for long in his heart, the cruelest and bittersweet memory of his life. Chapter 26. The external relations of Alexey Alexandrovitch and his wife had remained unchanged. The sole difference lay in the fact that he was more busily occupied than ever. As in former years, at the beginning of the spring, he had gone to a foreign watering place for the sake of his health. deranged by the winter's work that every year grew heavier, and just as always, he returned in July and at once fell to work as usual with increased energy. As usual, too, his wife had moved for the summer to a villa out of town, while he remained in Petersburg. From the date of their conversation after the party at Princess Tverskaya's, he had never spoken again to Anna of his suspicions and his jealousness, and that habitual tone of his bantering mimicry was the most convenient tone possible for his present attitude to his wife. He was a little colder to his wife. He simply seemed to be slightly displeased with her for the first and midnight conversation, which he had repelled. In his attitude to her there was a shade of vexation, but nothing more. You would not be open with me, he seemed to say, mentally addressing her. So much the worse for you. Now you may beg as you please, but I won't be open with you. So much the worse for you, he said mentally, like a man who, after vainly attempting to extinguish a fire, should fly in a rage with his vain efforts and say, "Oh, very well then, you shall burn for this." This man, so subtle and astute in official life, did not realize all the senselessness of such an attitude to his wife. He did not realize it because it was too terrible to him to realize his actual position, and he shut down and locked and sealed up in his heart that secret place where lay hid his feelings towards his family, that is, his wife and son. He who had been such a careful father had from the end of that winter become peculiarly frigid to his son, and adopted to him just the same bantering tone he used with his wife. "Aha, young man," was the greeting with which he met him. Alexey Alexandrovitch asserted and believed that he had never in any previous year had so much official business as that year. But he was not aware that he sought work for himself that year, that this was one of the means for keeping shut the secret place where lay hid his feelings towards his wife and son, and his thoughts about them, which became more terrible the longer they lay there. If anyone had had the right to ask Alexey Alexandrovitch what he thought of his wife's behavior, the mild and peaceable Alexey Alexandrovitch would have made no answer, but he would have been greatly angered with the man who should question him on the subject. For this reason, there positively came into Alexey Alexandrovitch's face a look of haughtiness and severity whenever anyone inquired after his wife's health. Alexey Alexandrovitch did not want to talk at all about his wife's behavior, and he actually succeeded in not thinking about it at all. Alexey Alexandrovitch's permanent summer villa was in Perhoff, and Countess Lydia Ivanova used as a rule to spend the summer there, close to Anna, and constantly seeing her. That year, Countess Lydia Ivanovna declined to settle in Peterhof, was not once at Anna Arkadyevna's, and in conversation with Alexey Alexandrovitch hinted at the unsuitability of Anna's close intimacy with Betsy and Vronsky. Alexey Alexandrovitch sternly cut her short, roundly declaring his wife was to be above suspicion, and from that time began to avoid Countess Lydia Ivanovna. He did not want to see and did not see that many people in society cast dubious glances on his wife. He did not want to understand and did not understand why his wife had so particularly insisted on staying at Zarsko, where Betsy was staying, and not far from the camp of Vronsky's regiment. He did not allow himself to think about it, and he did not think about it, but all the same, though he never admitted it to himself, and had no proofs, not even suspicious evidence. In the bottom of his heart, he knew beyond all doubt that he was a deceived husband, and he was profoundly miserable about it. How often during those 8 years of happy life with his wife, Alexei Alexandrovich had looked at other men's faithless wives and other deceived husbands and asked himself, how can people descend to that? How is it they don't put an end to such a hideous position? But now, when the misfortune had come upon himself, he was so far from thinking of putting an end to the position that he would not recognize it at all, would not recognize it just because it was too awful, too unnatural. Since his return from abroad, Alexei Alexandrovich had twice been at the country villa. Once he dined there, another time he spent the evening there with a party of friends, but he had not once stayed the night there as it had been his habit to do in previous years. The day of the races had been a very busy day for Alexey Alexandrovich, but when mentally sketching out the day in the morning, he made up his mind to go to their country house to see his wife immediately after dinner, and from there to the races, which all the count were to witness, and at which he was bound to be present. He was going to see his wife because he had determined to see her once a week to keep up appearances. And besides, on that day, as it was the 15th, he had to give his wife some money for her expenses, according to their usual arrangement. With his habitual control over his thoughts, though he thought all this about his wife, he did not let his thoughts stray farther in regard to her. That morning was a very full one for Alexey Alexandrovich. The evening before, Countess Lydia Ivanovna had sent him a pamphlet by a celebrated traveler in China who was staying in Petersburg, and with it she enclosed a note begging him to see the traveler himself, as he was an extremely interesting person from various points of view and likely to be useful. Alexey Alexandrovich had not had time to read the pamphlet through in the evening and finished it in the morning. Then people began arriving with petitions, and there came the reports, interviews, appointments, dismissals, apportionment of rewards, pensions, grants, notes, the workday round, as Alexey Alexandrovich called it. That always took up so much time. Then there was private business of his own, a visit from the doctor and the steward who managed his property. The steward did not take up much time. He simply gave Alexey Alexandrovich the money he needed, together with a brief statement of the position of his affairs, which was not altogether satisfactory, as it had happened that during the year, owing to increased expenses, more had been paid out than usual, and there was a deficit. But the doctor, a celebrated Petersburg doctor, who was an intimate acquaintance of Alexey Alexandrovich, took up a great deal of time. Alexey Alexandrovich had not expected him that day and was surprised at his visit, and still more so when the doctor questioned him very carefully about his health, listened to his breathing, and tapped at his liver. Alexey Alexandrovich did not know that his friend Lydia Ivanovna, noticing that he was not as well as usual that year, had begged the doctor to go and examine him. "Do this for my sake," the Countess Lydia Ivanovna had said to him. "I will do it for the sake of Russia, Countess," replied the doctor. "A priceless man," said the Countess Lydia Ivanovna. The doctor was extremely dissatisfied with Alexey Alexandrovich. He found the liver considerably enlarged and the digestive powers weakened, while the course of mineral waters had been quite without effect. He prescribed more physical exercise as far as possible, and as far as possible less mental strain, and above all no worry. In other words, just what was as much out of Alexey Alexandrovich's power as abstaining from breathing. Then he withdrew, leaving in Alexey Alexandrovich an unpleasant sense that something was wrong with him, and that there was no chance of curing it. As he was coming away, the doctor chanced to meet on the staircase an acquaintance of his. Sludin, who was secretary of Alexei Alexandrovich's department. They had been comrades at the university, and though they rarely met, they thought highly of each other and were excellent friends, and so there was no one to whom the doctor would have given his opinion of a patient so freely as to Sludin. "How glad I am you've been seeing him," said Sludin. "He's not well, and I fancy—" "Well, what do you think of him?" "I'll tell you," said the doctor, beckoning over Sludin's head to his coachman to bring the carriage around. "It's just this," said the doctor, taking a finger of his kid glove with his white hands and pulling it. "If you don't strain the strings, then try to break them, you'll find it difficult job. But strain a string to its very utmost, and mere weight of one finger on the strained string will snap it." And with his close assiduity, his conscious devotion to his work, he strained to the utmost, and there's some outside burden weighing on him, and not a light one, concluded the doctor, raising his eyebrows significantly. "Will you be at the races?" he asked. He added, as he sank into a seat in the carriage. Yes, to be sure. It does waste a lot of time," the doctor responded vaguely to some reply of Sludin's he had not caught. Directly after the doctor, who had taken up so much time, came the celebrated traveler and Alexei Alexandrovich. By means of the pamphlet he had only just finished reading, and his previous acquaintance with the subject impressed the traveler by the depth of his knowledge of the subject and the breadth and enlightenment of his view of it. At the same time as the traveler, there was announced a provincial marshal of nobility on a visit to Petersburg, with whom Alexei Alexandrovich had to have some conversation. After his departure, he had to finish the daily routine of business with his secretary, and then he still had to drive round to call on a certain great personage on the matter of grave and serious import. Alexei Alexandrovich only just managed to be back by 5 o'clock, his dinner hour, and after dining with his secretary, he invited him to drive with him to his country villa and to the races. Though he did not acknowledge it to himself, Alexei Alexandrovich always tried nowadays to secure the presence of a third person in his interviews with his wife. Chapter 27. Let me see how long this one is. Oh, very short. Anna was upstairs, standing before the looking glass, and with Anushka's assistance pinning the last ribbon on her gown, when she heard carriage wheels crunching the gravel in the entrance. "It's too early for Betsy," she thought, and glancing out of the window, she caught sight of the carriage and the black hat of Alexei Alexandrovich, and the ears that she knew so well sticking up each side of it. How unlucky! Can he be going to stay the night? She wondered, and the thought of all that might come of such a chance struck her as so awful and terrible that without dwelling on it for a moment, she went down to meet him with a bright and radiant face, and conscious of the presence of the spirit of falsehood and deceit in herself that she had come to know of late. She abandoned herself to the spirit and began talking, hardly knowing of what she was saying. "Ah, how nice of you," she said, giving her husband her hand and greeting Sludin, who was like one of the family, with a smile. "You're staying the night, I hope," was the first word the spirit of falsehood prompted her to utter. "And now we'll go together, only it's a pity I promised Betsy she's coming for me." Alexei Alexandrovich knit his brows on Betsy's name. "Oh, I'm not going to separate the inseparables," he said in his usual bantering tone. "I'm going with Mihail Vasilovich. I'm ordered exercise by the doctors, too. I'll walk and fancy myself at the springs again." "There's no hurry," said Anna, Would you like tea? She rang. Bring in tea and tell Soyoza that Alexei Alexandrovich is here. Well, tell me, how have you been, Mihail Vasilovich? You've not been to see me before. Look how lovely it is out on the terrace, she said, turning first to one and then to the other. She spoke very simply and naturally, but too much and too fast. She was the more aware of this from noticing in the inquisitive look Mihail Vasilovich turned on her that he was, as it were, keeping watch on her. Mihail Vasilovich promptly went out on the terrace. She sat down beside her husband. You don't look quite well, she said. Yes, he said. The doctor's been with me today and wasted an hour of my time. I feel that some of our friends must have sent him. My health's so precious, it seems. No, what did he say? She questioned him about his health and what he had been doing, and tried to persuade him to take a rest and come out to her. All this she said brightly, rapidly, with a peculiar brilliance in her eyes. But Alexey Alexandrovitch did not attach any special significance to this tone of hers. He heard only her words and gave them only the direct sense they bore, and he answered simply, though jestingly. There was nothing remarkable at all this conversation, but never alter could Anna recall the brief scene without an agonizing pang of shame. Oh, but never after. Sorry, looked like the word alter. So Yoisa came in, preceded by his governess. If Alexey Alexandrovitch had allowed himself to observe, he would have noticed the timid and bewildered eyes with which Soyoza glanced first at his father and then at his mother. But he would not see anything, and he did not see it. Ah, the young man, he's grown. Really, he's getting quite a man. How are you, young man? And he gave his hand to the scared child. Sohoiza had been shy of his father before, and now, ever since Alexey Alexandrovitch had taken to calling him young man, and since that insolent question had occurred to him whether Vronsky were a friend or a foe, he avoided his father. He looked round towards his mother as though seeking shelter. It was only with his mother that he was at ease. Meanwhile, Alexey Alexandrovitch was holding his son by the shoulder while he was speaking to the governess, and Sirhoiza was so miserably uncomfortable that Anna saw he was on the point of tears. Anna, flushed who had flushed a little the instant her son came in, noticing that Sirhoiza was uncomfortable, got up hurriedly, took Alexey Alexandrovitch's hand from her son's shoulder, and kissing the boy, led him out to the terrace and quickly came back. It's time to start, though, she said, glancing at her watch. How is it Betsy doesn't come? Yes, said Alexey Alexandrovitch, and getting up, he folded his hands and cracked his fingers. I've come to bring you some money, too, for nightingales. We know. Can't live on fairy tales, he said. You want it, I expect? No, I don't. Yes, I do, she said, not looking at him and crimsoning to the roots of her hair. But you'll come back here after the races, I suppose? Oh, yes, answered Alexey Alexandrovitch. And here's the glory of Peterhof. Princess Tverskaya, he added, looking out the window as the elegant English carriage with the tiny seats placed extremely high. What elegance! Charming. Well, let us starting to then. Princess Tverskaya did not get out of her carriage. Her groom, in high boots, cape, and black hat, darted out at the entrance. I'm going. Goodbye, said Anna, and kissing her son, she went up to Alexey Alexandrovitch and held out her hand to him. It was ever so nice of you to come. Alexey Alexandrovitch kissed her hand. Well, au revoir then. You'll come back for some tea? That's delightful, she said, and went out gay and radiant. But as soon As she no longer saw him, she was aware of the spot on her hand that his lips had touched, and she shuddered with repulsion. I think I'm going to go ahead and end it there, and I will try to be back in a couple days to read on. It is getting good. Sorry if it takes me so long and slowly to get through these chapters. It's just all the long words, and you don't even realize that the sentences are written differently than we write things now until you're reading it. So it seems a bit awkward, but I'm trying my best to make it not be so. So with that, I am going to go and I will see you guys later. Tell me what you think of the chapters. Were you surprised at what happened with the horse? It's like as I was reading, I could tell it was going to happen. So, what do you guys think? Could you guys tell it was going to happen as well? I feel so sorry for that horse. I wanted to cry, but I had to keep reading. So, anyway, I will talk to you guys later. Remember, you matter. If you ever need me, just get a hold of me. And remember, you are gorgeous and beautiful and handsome. So, I will talk to you later. Later.